The letter on my door, the first time I truly questioned the sanity of my HOA, was the morning I found a fluorescent orange letter taped to my front door. It was a Tuesday, 7:32 a.m. I remember the time exactly because I was holding my third cup of coffee, barefoot on the porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. Kids waited for the bus. A jogger waved at me. Sprinklers ticked across manicured lawns. Everything seemed normal. Until I saw that ridiculous piece of paper fluttering in the breeze. At first glance, I thought it was a flyer. Maybe a lost pet or a community garage sale. But as I pulled it down, the bold words at the top struck me like a slap in the face. Notice of HOA fine violation, excess vehicles. My brow furrowed. I scanned the page. The letter accused me of violating Section 14.3b of the HOA guidelines, citing that I had excessive vehicular presence on the premises and have been observed housing more than the community allotted number of vehicles on the driveway and curb. It demanded a fine of $500 due within 7 days. I laughed. Out loud, not because the fee was funny though. It was but because this was the third time this year I'd received a notice from the HOA. First, they claimed my garden was too wild. Then they said my Christmas lights had been a safety hazard. Now this? Over cars? Here's the thing. Yes, I had more than the average number of cars parked at my house. But they weren't broken down rust buckets. Every car was spotless insured and rotated out regularly. Why? Because I wasn't just a guy with too many toys. I was a car investor. People flip houses. I flip cars. My property was zoned residential commercial, thanks to a grandfather clause I'd secured years ago. My legal team had it in writing. I ran a legitimate online luxury auto business and stored vehicles temporarily before auction. Clean, regulated, and totally legal. But of course the HOA didn't ask. They never do. Instead, they sent the worst of them, Marcia, the HOA board president. Or as the whole block liked to whisper behind hedges, HOA Karen. She was retired nosy and had too much time on her hands. It was like she turned HOA violations into a competitive sport. Marcia once tried to fine a veteran for flying a flag on his porch on Veterans Day. This time, though, she went too far. The violation claimed I'd been warned multiple times, which was completely untrue. The letter even threatened that if I didn't comply, further legal action could be taken, including a lien on my home. Oh, really? I chuckled again, but this time it was colder. See, what Marcia didn't know was simple. I owned her house. In fact, I owned half the neighborhood. How it all started years ago. Before I became financially independent, I lived right here in this same neighborhood as a broke mechanic with big dreams. I rented a 2-bedroom house with a leaky garage and mowed lawns on weekends for extra cash. I watched people like Marcia patrol the streets like little dictators, drunk on minor power, but I never gave them a reason to bother me. After a few years, I made my first lucky break by flipping an abandoned Mercedes I found through a police auction. Then another, then a Porsche. With every flip I built capital, I learned, I networked. And eventually, I made a company out of it, Vanguard Auto Holdings. As my wealth grew, I noticed something. Properties in this area were undervalued, and some residents, especially older ones, were looking to move or downsize. I started buying. Quietly. An offer here. A discreet cash purchase there, sometimes under my own name, sometimes through my LLC. I bought houses, duplexes, and a few townhomes. By the time the pandemic hit, I'd acquired 31 properties. All in the same HOA, a jurisdiction. All voting members. Legally. But I kept living like a regular guy. Still wore jeans and flannel. Still mowed my lawn. I never made a fuss, never showed off. But I watched, especially Marcia. She'd walk by my house every Sunday with her little clipboard and smug smile. I once caught her measuring my mailbox to see if it met HO aesthetic height standards. Another time, she peered over my fence to check if my landscaping had excessive weeds. I let her play her game, until now. Because now, it was my move. The call later that day, I made a few phone calls. First to my legal team, then to a few of my tenants, who also happen to be property owners. HOAs operate like miniature governments, but they're ruled by their own bylaws. One of those bylaws stated that any homeowner could call for a vote to re-elect or dissolve the current board if a quorum was reached, defined as 51% of homeowners agreeing to the motion. What Marcia didn't know is that I already had more than 50% of the neighborhood votes in my own name. So I called a meeting. I had the legal right to do it, and I posted the notice in every mailbox. The fallout begins when Marcia received the meeting notice. She stormed up to my house, fists clenched, lips tight. "You can't do this," she snapped. I smiled politely, coffee in hand. "Actually, I can. The bylaws are very clear. A new election must be held once quorum is established." Her eyes narrowed. "This is your doing. You've manipulated your way in. You're buying out the neighborhood." I shrugged. "I'm investing, legally, transparently. I didn't break a single rule. Unlike someone who sent out fines without due process." She looked like she might explode. And then, before she could say another word, one of the neighbors, a man she'd fined last month for having a non-approved barbecue grill, walked up. "Count me in for the vote," he said. Then another. And another. The neighborhood wasn't just turning. It was awakening. The HOA showdown. The community center stood at the edge of Brookside Lane, a modest building with polished oak doors, red brick walls, and the faint scent of lemon-scented floor polish that seemed to cling to the air no matter the season. On most days, it served as a quiet venue for knitting clubs and birthday parties. But tonight, the place felt different, electric, charged with tension so thick you could slice it with a butter knife. Every parking space was taken. Residents spilled onto the sidewalk, murmuring in hushed tones. Even the usually sleepy-eyed teenagers from down the block had shown up, their curiosity piqued by the rare and thrilling promise of neighborhood drama. Inside, the chairs were lined up in rows, most already occupied. Some people stood along the back wall, arms folded, eyes locked on the wooden podium at the front of the room. There, beneath the stern glare fluorescent lighting, sat the HOA board, 3 stiff-backed members in matching navy blazers, and at the center, like a queen on her throne, sat Marcia. Her lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line, her perfectly ironed blouse starched to military standards. On the surface she was composed, but the tapping of her pen on the desk betrayed the storm brewing within. Stepped inside just before 7 p.m., dressed in jeans, boots, and a dark blazer, not flashy, not arrogant, just confident. The room quieted when they saw me. A few neighbors gave subtle nods of encouragement. One man clapped once, then stopped awkwardly when Marcia shot him a glare that could curdle milk. I made my way to the front and took my seat in the reserved section. Marcia cleared her throat and adjusted her microphone. "This meeting has been called under Article 12, Section 4 of our bylaws, concerning the request to dissolve the current HOA board. As per procedure, a vote will be taken. Before we proceed, I'd like to address the community regarding the nature of recent events." She stood, her voice sharp and theatrical, as if performing for a courtroom jury rather than her neighbors. "There have been rumors, false ones, I might add, about hostile takeovers, secret ownership, and conspiracy. Let me be perfectly clear. Our board has acted in the best interest of this community for over 6 years. We've upheld values, order, safety, and we will not allow our home to fall into chaos at the hands of greed." I didn't flinch. I let her talk. It was her last monologue after all. The moment she sat down, I stood. I didn't need a microphone. My voice carried. "Greed, you say? Interesting. Because when you fined Mr. Ellison for parking his late wife's Car on the curb, without even warning him, you called it enforcement. When you sent threatening letters to the Ramirez family over their garden gnome decorations, you said it was about community aesthetics. And when you demanded I pay a $500 fine for cars on my own private property, you didn't even bother to check the zoning permit or my business license. A murmur spread through the crowd. Marcia shifted in her seat, but I didn't let her speak. Here's what you didn't know, Marcia, I continued. Over the past 3 years, I've quietly purchased 31 properties in this neighborhood. That includes 12 owner-occupied homes and 19 rental properties, some of which are occupied by people in this very room. Every one of those homes comes with voting rights under the HOA charter. I reached into my briefcase and held up the stack of notarized proxy forms. Signed, certified, legal, and together, they represent 51% of the total votes within the HOA, effective immediately. I am calling for a motion to dissolve the current board under Article 12.4 and to nominate a new interim committee of 5 homeowners who actually live here, respect the community, and want fairness, not power. Gasps filled the room. People sat up straighter. Some cheered. A few looked stunned silent, as if they had just witnessed a magician pull a house out of a hat. Marcia stood again, trembling slightly. This is a circus. This is manipulation. You're buying people out, coercing them to vote against their own interest. No, I said calmly. I've spoken to every tenant, every homeowner. I gave no incentives, no threats. I asked them one question. Are you happy with how things are run? And that was the truth. I never twisted arms. I didn't need to. People were sick of the tyranny of clipboards and citations. I call for the vote now, I said, turning to the crowd. All those in favor of dissolving the current board and appointing an interim one pending new elections next month, please raise your hand. One by one, arms went up, dozens, then more. Even longtime residents who had once nodded politely at Marcia during Sunday strolls now stood with their hands raised high. A man from the back yelled, "We're tired of the HOA acting like the KGB." Laughter erupted. It was over. The board was voted out legally, democratically. The crowd applauded as Marcia's face drained of color. She didn't say a word. She gathered her papers, straightened her blazer, and marched out the door without so much as a glance back. The morning after the next morning was unusually quiet. Birds chirped, lawnmowers hummed. But there were no clipboard patrols, no orange notices taped to doors. The HOA Facebook group had gone silent, aside from a few celebratory memes and a post by Mr. Ellison saying, "Justice tastes better than coffee." At 9 a.m., I met with the newly formed interim HOA committee. 5 residents I'd personally nominated, each with a record of honesty, compassion, and a desire to serve the neighborhood, not rule it. One of them, a retired teacher named Grace, looked at me and said, "Thank you for everything. You didn't have to do this." I smiled. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because this neighborhood gave me a start when I had nothing. This is me giving back. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Well, you just gave us back our home." The Queen's Gambit. 3 days had passed since the community's historic HOA shakeup, and though the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm of morning jogs and evening lawn sprinklers, a subtle change pulsed beneath the surface. You could feel it in the way people lingered on sidewalks, stopping to talk with neighbors they used to avoid. Porch lights seemed a little brighter. There was laughter in driveways. A burden had been lifted, and while many believed the battle was over, I knew better. In the quiet spaces of victory, that's where bitterness brews. That Sunday morning, I was having coffee on my porch, just as I always did, when Grace, the retired teacher who now sat on the interim committee, approached with an envelope in her hand. Her steps were hesitant, her eyes filled with unease. "I found this in the HOA mailbox," she said quietly, handing it to me. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with a heavy wax emblem. Definitely not the typical HOA. Correspondence. I peeled it open, my brows furrowing as I pulled out a letter, elegantly typed and signed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Elias Wren, the same Elias who once chaired the Regional Property Development Council. A man whose empire of suburban properties spanned 5 states. He was a shark in a suit, a legend in the industry, and the one person who 5 years ago laughed me out of his office when I pitched my idea for a community-run property ownership model. You want renters to help govern an HOA? He'd mocked, "You'll have chaos by Christmas." And yet, here he was, writing me. The letter was short but pointed. He had heard of the upheaval in Oak Ridge Estates. A community transformation, he called it. He congratulated me and requested a meeting private, off the books, with an offer I'd be foolish to ignore. It ended with a single line that sat like lead in my stomach. Not everyone believes you should be in charge, Mr. Ramirez, and some are willing to ensure you won't be. I folded the letter slowly and leaned back in my chair, eyes scanning the street. Marcia's home, one of the only properties in the neighborhood I didn't own, had its curtains drawn. Her car hadn't moved in days, but her silence felt less like surrender and more like strategy. She was quiet, yes, but she wasn't gone. Whispers and shadows over the next week, strange things began to happen. At first, they seemed like coincidences. A notice from the county assessor's office claimed a reassessment of my properties was underway due to suspiciously rapid acquisitions. Then, a zoning compliance officer visited unannounced, claiming to be following up on a tip that my vehicle business violated noise ordinances. Even my bank called to inform me that a formal inquiry had been filed, questioning the source of several of my property purchases, despite every single one being documented in legal dot, and each time a familiar chill crept up my spine. These weren't accidents. Someone was pulling levers behind closed doors. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Marcia might have lost her chair, but she still had friends, powerful ones. People like Elias Wren, who viewed HOAs not as communities, but as fortresses of control. My quiet rebellion had made waves, and those waves were starting to crash on shorelines far beyond Oak Ridge. Then came the worst blow. A letter from the regional court. A motion had been filed to temporarily freeze my voting rights in the HOA, alleging conflict of interest and unethical consolidation of property influence. The petitioner? None other than Marcia Lennox, with her attorney and associate from Elias's own firm arguing that my ownership gave me unfair sway in a community meant to be equitably governed. This wasn't just petty revenge anymore. This was war, turning the tables. I wasn't naive. I knew this system could be manipulated. But what they didn't understand was that I had built my empire not just with money, but with people. With trust. And when power players like Marcia and Elias tried to paint me as a monopolist, my neighbors saw something else. The guy who shoveled their snow when the plow skipped their house, who helped fund the community playground, who mowed lawns for free when folks were sick. My strength wasn't in property, it was in loyalty. So I called a community of my own. It wasn't formal. No suits. No microphones. Just a cookout at the neighborhood park, grills going, kids running around, neighbors gathered under string lights and folding chairs. But at the center of it, I stood with my heart open. I told them everything. About Elias, about Marcia's legal petition, about the smear campaign quietly being built behind closed doors to paint me as a dangerous monopolist. I didn't fight to take over this neighborhood, I said to them. I fought to protect it from people who think power belongs to the loudest voice, not the wisest one. And now they want to rip it away from us because they couldn't control it. There was silence at first, then applause, then roars of support. Neighbors came forward with their own stories of how Marcia had fined them, intimidated them, ignored their concerns. People offered to write statements, submit character testimonies. A retired judge in the neighborhood even volunteered to oversee a legal defense fund. The tide wasn't just turning. It was rising. The Queen's last moved 2 weeks later. I met Elias face to face. It was a private club in the city, all velvet chairs and leather-bound menus. He smiled as if we were old friends and leaned back with the smug confidence of a man used to bending others. "I admire your tenacity, Jason," he said, "but you're playing a dangerous game. This community was never meant to be democratic. People don't know what's best for them. That's why we manage." I leaned in slowly. "That's exactly why you lost. You mistake control for stability. I trust people. You just manipulate them." He chuckled. "You think you've won? Even if Marcia fails in court, there are others. I've already begun talks with 2 HOAs in adjacent communities. If I can't knock down your house, I'll surround it." I stood and picked up my coat. "Then I guess I'll just have to buy the whole block." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a thin smile, he said, "You're a problem, Ramirez. And problems get solved." I left without another word. But I knew what that meant. This was no longer about Oak Ridge. This was the start of something much bigger. Asterisk. Expansion and resistance. It started with 1 phone call, then another, then 5 more by the end of the week. Presidents of nearby HOAs, long frustrated but fearful of consequences, were reaching out quietly, discreetly, but urgently. They'd heard what happened in Oak Ridge Estates. Word of Marcia's dramatic fall from power, of Elias Wren's involvement, and of my decisive, unapologetic ownership had spread beyond our borders like wildfire. But more than that, they heard something even more powerful. There was a way out. People were desperate for change. In Lakeside Grove, a single mother had been fined $300 for painting her mailbox blue. In Cedar Hills, an elderly couple had their solar panels forcibly removed for violating roofline conformity. In Eastwind Glen, entire families lived under constant threat of eviction for minor landscaping issues. These weren't communities anymore, they were fiefdoms. And the local HOA boards, backed by development companies like Elias's, had turned neighborhoods into authoritarian pockets disguised as suburban safety. I didn't plan on becoming a symbol. But the more stories I heard, the more I realized Oak Ridge wasn't an exception, it was the beginning. If Elias thought he could silence me with court filings and backdoor zoning attacks, he underestimated what I'd become. I was no longer defending a neighborhood. I was leading a revolution. But revolutions are rarely quiet. That's when the real pushback began. Escalation. It started subtly. Anonymous tipsters called city officials to report that my auto transport business was a front for illegal operations. Inspectors started showing up unannounced, armed with clipboards, smug attitudes, and citations written before they even walked in. A delivery truck was mysteriously towed from my warehouse lot, despite being fully permitted and registered. A journalist I trusted called to warn me that a hit piece was being prepared about me. Local landlord exploits HOA loophole to seize control. It would include twisted half-truths and quotes from residents paid off or pressured to speak out. And the worst part? Someone hacked into the HOA's digital records. At first, we didn't notice. Then we realized someone had edited key entries, meeting logs, votes, financials. The changes made it look like I had approved self-benefiting contracts and forced out dissenters. They were preparing a legal trap. They wanted the community to believe I was no better than the tyrants I'd fought against. But I wasn't alone. Grace, our quiet and diligent committee chair, pulled 2 all-nighters combing through archived paper files that predated the digital system. She found the originals, handwritten, time-stamped, sealed. They were our evidence. A retired systems engineer in the neighborhood volunteered to trace the IP address that accessed the system. He found it linked not to Marcia's home, but to a server inside the offices of Wren Management Corp. That's when it hit me. Elias wasn't just helping Marcia, he was orchestrating an all-out counterinsurgency. And then came the bombshell. I was being sued. Personally. A class action suit, filed in the county court, alleging racketeering, unethical acquisition, and civil conspiracy. The plaintiff list included Marcia and a handful of hand-picked witnesses, several of whom didn't even live in Oak Ridge anymore. The goal wasn't to win, it was to bury me in court fees, legal distractions, and public doubt. Elias wanted me occupied, discredited, and broke. But I had one thing he didn't: the will of the people. A movement is born instead of shrinking back. I expanded. With the help of the community committee, we launched the Neighborhood Freedom Initiative, a nonprofit advocacy group dedicated to helping homeowners take back control from abusive HOA regimes. We created templates for residents to challenge illegal fines. We hosted free legal workshops on voting rights and HOA transparency. We partnered with a retired real estate attorney who offered pro bono representation. Within a month, 10 neighboring communities joined us. We didn't just organize, we educated. And as the movement grew, the public narrative changed. Local media stopped parroting Elias's smear campaigns and began running deep dives into the abuses of HOAs across the state. Residents across the suburbs began forming neighborhood defense councils. A state representative even contacted us, expressing interest in introducing new HOA regulation reform bills. Elias and his cronies had fought against for decades, but perhaps the most unexpected ally came in the form of Daniel Lee, a mid-level executive who used to work under Elias at Wren Management. He had quit 3 months ago, disillusioned and disgusted. Quiet, professional, and fiercely intelligent, Daniel reached out to me through a burner email. "I have documentation," he said. "Financial records, pressure emails, internal memos. Proof that Elias has been using HOAs to launder funds and coerce zoning boards." It was everything I needed, but he had one condition: you can use it, but you have to be ready. Because the moment you expose this, Elias won't come at you with lawsuits or fake neighbors. He'll go higher. He'll go darker. I nodded. We're past the point of retreat. The truth begins to burn. I remember the night we released the evidence like it was yesterday. We didn't hand it to the media. We handed it to the people. At a town hall broadcast online and in person, we released redacted emails showing Elias approving fine quotas to increase HOA revenue. Spreadsheets showed HOA board members getting kickbacks for pushing fines and restrictions that forced people to sell homes, often to development arms owned by Elias's affiliates. The crowd sat in stunned silence. Grace, with tears in her eyes, looked at me and whispered, "You did it. You proved it." "No," I whispered back, "we did." Within a week, a state investigation was opened. Wren Management stocks plummeted. A formal complaint was filed with the Real Estate Oversight Commission. Elias's grip was loosening, one nail at a time. But then we got word. Marcia had disappeared, gone, no forwarding address, her home sold, her bank accounts liquidated. And with her, a key witness in both Elias's network and the class action suit. But she didn't run out of fear. She ran because of her final move, one none of us saw coming. Hidden deed transfer. Grace found it buried in old property records. Marcia had sold Oak Ridge's community center, our central meeting place, parkland, and records archive too. Days before she was voted out, to a shell company registered in Delaware. And that shell company? It was owned by Elias Wren. The land had been quietly rezoned, and demolition permits had been filed. Our history, our fight, our future. They planned to bulldoze it all. Asterisk. The final stand. The morning dawned gray and heavy, shadows stretching across Oak Ridge estates like a warning. The community center, once the heart of our neighborhood gatherings, now stood as a threat looming over our fight. Bulldozers were scheduled to arrive in less than 72 hours. I stepped onto the front lawn, heart pounding, scanning the site where generations had celebrated birthdays, held meetings, and forged connections. Every scraped knee and joyous cheer in that ground had a story I knew. If they demolished it, they weren't just tearing down a building. They were attempting to wipe out everything we'd worked for and the people who believed in us. I called an emergency meeting with the interim committee. The decision was unanimous. We would legally challenge the transfer, seek an injunction, and if needed, occupy the site physically. It was a bold move. It was risky. But defeat was not an option. Within hours, a team of pro bono attorneys had drawn up motions. Local residents began making signs, "Save our center. No bulldozers here." Social media lit up with neighbors, pledging to stand inside the building, ready to defend it with their voices and presence. By the next evening, cameras were lined up at the curb while protesters, our neighbors, friends, families stood at the doors of the community center. News vans arrived, and reporters interviewed residents whose stories ranged from childhood memories to grandchildren's first dances held on that very floor. The media's attention brought pressure. Suddenly, the permit office began to delay. The demolition contract went unsigned. Even Elias Wren's office released a vague statement claiming the sale was legal and nothing to see, but words meant less when cameras were pointed directly at row upon row of determined faces ready to stand firm. Still, we needed a legal win. On the courthouse steps, our lead attorney slammed a stack of documents down. Copies of the shell company deed, communications showing Marcia's conflict of interest, falsified board minutes suggesting the sale was approved, none of which were real. The court agreed to a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing in 14 days, a reprieve, but not a resolution. As the interim reprieve held, Elias unleashed his next blow, a press release claiming I had manipulated neighbors with promises of grants and free services, forcing them to participate in hostile occupation. A rumor campaign followed among whispers at soccer games, church gatherings, and grocery lines. They were back to old tactics, character assassination and doubt. But this time, the community pushed back. Neighbors stood together, told their own stories on video, testified in public forums. The movement we built became a chorus of voices, too powerful to ignore. Amid the chaos, I watched my children play tag around picnic tables, their laughter echoing off the walls we were fighting to save. I felt the weight of responsibility in that moment, the burden of knowing every decision affected not just me, but everyone who believed in a better future for this neighborhood. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I drafted what could be the most important speech of my life, one meant not just to argue legalities, but to appeal to a deeper sense of community, to stand tall in the face of greed, deception, and fear. The courtroom was packed. Rows of residents, reporters with pens poised, attorneys shuffling papers, Elias Wren's legal team in dark suits, stern and unyielding. The judge, a no-nonsense figure with steely eyes, entered and commanded silence. The hearing began with legal procedure, my team presenting evidence of the illegal deed transfer, Marcia's fraudulent vote manipulation, and the false pretenses under which the sale occurred. One by one, witnesses took the stand: retired teacher Grace, who found the deed, the systems engineer who traced the digital tampering, and neighbors who detailed Marcia's last-minute conflict of interest bid to sell. When it was my turn, I didn't need documents. I presented memories. "Your Honor," I said softly, eyes scanning the faces in the courtroom, "this isn't just a case about a deed. It's about respect, trust, and the power of community." My neighbors didn't stand up because I asked them to. They stood because they believed. I paused, letting that sentiment sink in. We are fighting for roots, for belonging, for a place where our children can grow without fear of being bulldozed for profit. The silence that followed was deafening. Later that afternoon, the judge made his ruling. Elias's shell company had no legal standing to enforce the sale. The deed transfer was invalid due to Marcia's conflict of interest and lack of proper board approval. The temporary injunction was extended indefinitely. The land remained in the hands of the homeowners association, right where it belonged. Cheer erupted. Tears fell. Hugs followed. The community center would live after the storm months passed. The legal battles faded into memory, replaced by community picnics, renovation projects, and state-level discussions about HOA reform inspired by our story. The Neighborhood Freedom Initiative continued to grow, influencing policy that regulated HOAs more strictly requiring board transparency, enforcing conflict of interest rules, and protecting homeowners from predatory practices. Elias Wren's influence waned. His shell companies collapsed under scrutiny, and he faced regulatory investigations. Marcia never returned. A few residents saw her briefly moving into a small town far away, but it was as if Oak Ridge had simply disappeared from her world. For me, it wasn't just about a community center. It was about turning pain into purpose, fear into freedom. My children grew up knowing their dad was willing to challenge titans, not for fame but for fairness. And somewhere in the quiet corners of our street, where laughter drifts into porches lit by warm lamplight, that truth shines like a beacon. On a crisp spring afternoon a year later, I stood at the renovated front doors of Oak Ridge's community center with a plaque reading, "In honor of every voice that fought to be heard." Neighbors packed the lawn, kids ran through sprinklers, and music drifted on the breeze. It was a celebration not just of survival but of renewal, of what happens when people refuse to be silenced. I looked around, heart full, and whispered to myself, we did good, because communities aren't buildings. They're people. And when people stand together, no board, no developer, no tyrant can bulldoze what belongs to their hearts. When legacy becomes law, 6 months had passed since the court ruling that saved the Oak Ridge Community Center. In those months, we didn't just rebuild the neighborhood, we transformed it. What once had been a battleground of control and oppression, under HOA tyranny, was now a shining example of what a united, self-governing community could look like. The flowers were blooming brighter, not because of better weather, but because people finally smiled while planting them. Families no longer whispered in fear of getting fined for letting their kids chalk the sidewalks. Retired veterans volunteered to mentor teens. The once quiet, suspicious nods between neighbors were now replaced with open-door greetings, community dinners, and laughter that rang down every block like a melody. But beneath that calm, I knew something deeper was happening, something historic. The changes in Oak Ridge had stirred discussions across the state. Other neighborhoods reached out, wanting guidance. Our inbox at the Neighborhood Freedom Initiative was overflowing with homeowners desperate for advice, protection, or even just validation that what they were enduring under corrupt HOA boards wasn't okay. We'd become something bigger than we ever imagined, not a support group, but a movement. Then the call came from State Representative Elena Ramirez. "Elijah," she said, voice urgent but hopeful, "we want to introduce legislation inspired by Oak Ridge." I froze. This wasn't just another complaint or case file. This was a chance to fix the entire system. Ramirez explained that the bill, tentatively named the Community Empowerment Act, would mandate transparent elections for all HOA boards, require third-party audits for fines and fees, limit the authority of boards to sell or rezone property without a 75% resident approval, and establish a statewide ombudsman office to handle HOA abuse complaints. And they wanted me to speak in front of the state legislature. The weight of it sat on my chest. This wasn't about our neighborhood anymore. This was about tens of thousands of families who had suffered quietly, who had been shamed or fined into submission, who had been told they didn't own the homes they worked so hard for. Not really. This was our chance to draw a permanent line in the sand. The road to reform. Preparing for that speech wasn't like any other. This wasn't court, this was politics. I didn't just need to be right, I needed to be powerful. Every word had to matter. I sat down with neighbors collecting stories. The teacher fined for installing a ramp for her disabled student. The war veteran told he couldn't fly a flag on his lawn. The young couple forced to sell their home when the HOA claimed a grill on the patio was a violation. These were more than anecdotes, they were living proof of a broken system. On the day of the hearing, I stood in a packed hall under the golden dome of the Capitol building. My palms were sweaty, but when I looked at the crowd, I saw familiar faces: Grace, Daniel, my kids, and dozens of Oak Ridge residents wearing matching shirts that read, "This is OUR home." Their presence gave me strength. I stepped up to the podium and began. For too long, we've treated HOAs like neighborhood babysitters, letting them act without oversight or consequence. We were told it was for property value, but how do you measure the value of dignity, of fairness, of freedom to live in your own home without fear? I paused, letting that land. We trusted boards and management companies. But what happened? When that trust was abused? When fines became tools of oppression? When dissent meant retaliation? That's not community. That's tyranny in a polo shirt. I shared our journey, how a petty feud over parking spiraled into a legal war, how corruption at the highest levels tried to silence our neighborhood, and how ordinary people fought back not with violence or vengeance, but with truth, unity, and a refusal to accept being powerless. I ended with one final sentence. If the law won't protect homeowners, it protects the wrong people. The chamber fell silent, then applause. And then, unanimous support from the public gallery. The last strike from the shadows, the media buzzed for weeks. HOA bill gains momentum thanks to Oak Ridge hero Jason Marks, the man who changed how neighborhoods are governed. But not everyone was celebrating. 3 nights after my testimony, my car was broken into. Nothing stolen, just papers scattered, glove box forced open, and a single word spray painted across the windshield. Enough. Police said it was likely intimidation. I knew it wasn't a random act. Elias Wren may have been bruised by the legal defeat and exposed in the court of public opinion. But snakes don't vanish, they go underground. Grace received a warning letter from a fake legal office threatening to audit her tax returns. Daniel's home Wi-Fi was hacked. Even the Neighborhood Freedom Initiative website suffered multiple denial of service attacks. Elias wasn't gone. He was regrouping, but this time we had backup. The Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation into Wren Management Corp. They subpoenaed bank records, development contracts, and emails that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. The IRS followed, and one by one, Elias's allies jumped ship. A whistleblower emerged, someone deep inside Wren Management, who handed over a hard drive with hundreds of documents detailing bid rigging, forced sales, and artificial fines, created to financially squeeze homeowners into foreclosure. It was worse than we thought. By spring, Elias Wren was arrested on charges of fraud, racketeering, and criminal conspiracy. His empire crumbled. Marcia, it turned out, had fled the country. Her extradition was pending. And in June, the Community Empowerment Act passed. Unanimously. Legacy, etched in stone. Months later, I stood at the new Oak Ridge Commons monument, placed right outside the restored community center. It bore the names of the original committee that stood together, not just to resist but to rebuild. Children played around it. Elderly neighbors sat in shaded benches reading books. The center had added a library and tutoring room for local kids. I was no hero. I was a man who got tired of being told to stay quiet. A father who just wanted his children to grow up in a place where they didn't need to fear the people who were supposed to protect them. But somehow that anger became purpose. That purpose became a movement. And that movement became law. I never asked for any of this. But I'd do it all again. Because Oak Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a message to every overreaching HOA board, every corrupt official, and every homeowner afraid to speak up. You're not alone. And you don't have to live in fear. Asterisk.